My name is Jana Rudler. I am the Southern Tier Field Consultant for the Preservation League of New York State, and today we're going to talk about Preservation League grants. Specifically, we're going to discuss Preserve New York grants. The Preserve New York grant cycle is just getting underway, and I'll talk about how to apply for that, what kind of projects we fund, and where our grant money comes from, things like that. So you'll learn everything you need to know about applying for a Preservation League grant. I'm going to begin to share my screen and we'll get underway. All right. All right, so welcome everyone. This presentation is all about Preserve New York grants. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors and funders who make the grant programs possible. Our grant programs are a partnership with the New York State Council on the Arts, with additional support from the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation and the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area. These webinars are funded in part by a grant from the John E. Streb Fund for New York of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Peggy N. and Roger G. Jerry Charitable Trust, with additional support from the Corning Incorporated Foundation. A little bit about the Preservation League of New York State. If you're not familiar with us, you see up on your screen right now, this is our mission. We invest in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic landscapes and buildings. We lead advocacy across the state, economic development, and education programs. So how do we meet our mission? We have a number of different programs available. Today we'll be talking about grants and loans that we offer. We also work with local preservation colleagues all across the state. These are organizations in your town that work for preservation every day on your behalf. So we're talking about the Preservation Association of the Southern Tier, PACNY in Syracuse, Preservation Long Island, Preservation Buffalo Niagara, and so many other organizations in between. So we work with everyone in the state to try to further preservation locally and at the state level. We work for public policy initiatives and advocacy. So the Preservation League of New York State is located in Albany, where we meet regularly with lawmakers in the Capitol to make sure that historic preservation always has a seat at the table when it comes to sustainable economic growth. We offer technical services. So our webinars are one example of that. We offer help with historic preservation, and we also offer sessions on historic preservation topics, and you'll be able to see those coming up in the next few months as part of our series. Hold on one second. I'm going to check out my questions. It looks like we've got a hand raised, and I want to make sure everyone gets their questions answered as we go along. Oh, I seem to have lost it. Okay. All right, let's continue. If you do have a question, I just want to remind you to please type it into your chat box at the bottom of your screen, and that is where I'll be going to answer questions. So if you raise your hand, I'm afraid I might not be able to help you out much from where I'm at right now, but type it into the chat box and I will be sure to get to your, oh, can we get a PDF? Yeah, that's a very good question, Judy. Yes, indeed. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll be sending out a follow-up email at the end of this presentation that will contain my PowerPoint slides and some useful links and things that we'll talk about in this presentation to help you out. All right, thank you. And thank you, you rock too, Judy. It was good talking with you. So back to our program. So we offer a bunch of different programs, technical services being one of them. We have our 7 to Save program. This is our biennial advocacy program for endangered historic sites across the state. And we just shine an extra light on properties that are endangered and need a little bit of extra help. This brings advanced technical services from us, a much greater exposure to the public through press and through exhibits and all sorts of things that we do through the 7 to Save program. We also offer excellence awards every year for outstanding preservation projects, individuals, organizations who are working hard for preservation. We do take nominations for those awards. I believe nominations are opening soon in the springtime, so keep an eye on our website. And if you know of somebody who's deserving of one of these awards, please nominate. One of our newest programs is our Preservation Book Club. This is a lot of fun. We read books with a preservation theme and we discuss them. Even if you haven't read the book, it's fun to sit in on these discussions. We often have authors come in and talk about their books. We just had Gretchen Soren talking about her book, Driving While Black, which has also been made into a documentary, so you can watch it or read it. We like to promote these books as much as possible. They teach people about preservation in a fun way. And last but not least, our Zabar scholarships are open to preservation students in New York State. So if you know a young person or a not so young person in school studying historic preservation, they might want an extra $1,000 in their pocket, and you can get that through our Zabar scholarships. All right, so when you're thinking about applying for a Preservation League grant, it's most likely because your building needs a little work. And so when you're thinking about capital project planning, there are some things that you want to consider before you start applying for grants. So think about how you're going to articulate how your project fits into your mission or how your building helps you meet your mission. So you want to make sure that your capital project is in line with your organization's mission. Make sure that everyone in your organization is on board with the project before you begin. So be sure your board of directors understands that a preservation planning grant, like what we offer at the Preservation League of New York State, is just the beginning in a long process of work for your building to help ensure its survival over the years. And they need to be ready to tackle everything that entails, not the least of which is some fundraising. So be sure that your executive director and your board and everybody on staff are on board with your project. And be sure and hire qualified building professionals. We can help you by providing a list of consultants who have worked on our projects over the years. And those consultants are architects, engineers, and other professionals who work on historic buildings. Now, they keep their own lists of contractors. So if you want to know who can do the brick and mortar work, we don't necessarily maintain a list like that here at the Preservation League. It would be extensive and constantly changing, but our consultants do maintain their own list. So once you begin to work with an architect or an engineer to plan what's best for your building, they'll be able to point you in the right direction for people who can actually do that work later on. So some other things to consider. The first 2 points on the screen, the condition assessment, looking at your building and trying to determine what exactly your building needs, and then your preservation planning study. Those are the 2 things that will go into a Preservation League grant application. So you're going to want to consider what exactly your building's needs are. Do you want to reuse an old building maybe for a new purpose that helps you further your mission? Do you want to see where to begin with some deferred maintenance? Maybe your building's just falling to pieces from top to bottom and you need to know where to begin. Decide exactly what it is that is most important for your building. And then look at what kind of preservation planning study would be most appropriate. And we're going to talk in a minute about the preservation planning studies that our grants cover. And I can also help you at some point select a grant that would make the most sense for your building. And then all the other points on this list, from capital project prioritization all the way through to the completion of your project, those are things that are going to come after your Preservation League grant. So make sure that your organization is prepared to tackle this whole list of things before you apply for a Preservation League grant. We want to know that your organization is capable of taking on that big capital project that comes after a preservation planning grant. So we're going to talk about our 2 grant programs. Our Technical Assistance Grants program has its deadline in the fall every year, and Preserve New York in the spring. So Preserve New York's coming up soon. I do want to mention the TAG grants too, because Preserve New York grants aren't for everyone. And so you'll see the difference between the 2 and be able to decide when to apply. Now, these grants are in partnership with the New York State Council on the Arts and with additional support from the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation. The Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area also contributes to our TAG grants and helps make projects possible in the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area. So a little about our technical assistance grants. I just talked about who funds them with the Preservation League. Our grants are open to nonprofits and municipalities only. So this applies to both our TAG grants and our P&Y grants. Religious organizations are not eligible to apply. And you also can't apply for state-owned properties. But we are always willing to help you find the resources you need to fund your project. So you can always give us a call if you're a church or religious organization, and we'll point you in the right direction. The applicant must own the building or have a long-term lease. A 6-year lease is the very minimum. We want to see long-term leases so that we know that you're actually the steward of that building for the foreseeable future. For our technical assistance grants only, the building needs to have an arts or a cultural purpose. So this is because of our partnership with NYSCA. They want to make sure that they're funding buildings that are supporting the arts more than anything. So our Preserve New York grants are a little different. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for technical assistance grants, arts and cultural purpose must apply. These grants top out around $4,000. Actually, $4,000 is the maximum for a TAG grant. And you're required to kick in a 20% cash match. We want to know you have some skin in the game and that you're really invested in this project. So your organization will have to come up with 20% of your ask as a match. So our TAG grants cover a number of different projects. Now, these project types are a little bit flexible. Buildings have all sorts of needs, and we want to make sure that you're able to assess those needs with a technical assistance grant. A building condition survey is a look at some specific issue that your building is facing. And we'll talk about building condition reports later with P&Y grants, but the building condition survey should address a specific issue or a specific set of issues that your building's facing. The picture on your screen is at the Science Museum of Long Island, and they needed to look specifically at the windows in this iconic building. So they wanted to know how best to preserve those windows, and a technical assistance grant helped them do that. TAG grants also cover engineering and structural analyses. So if you suspect that your building has a structural issue or you want to rule that out, then a TAG grant can cover that for you. Typically these studies, all of these studies are done by either architects or engineers. So those are the consultants you'll be working with for your project. Feasibility reuse studies are great. If you have a barn or a building that you want to reuse for your organization, then a feasibility reuse study can help you determine how best to do that. Specialized conservation studies they're fun. They cover a lot of different things from historic paint analysis to acoustic issues in buildings and pretty much everything in between. So if your building has an unusual issue and you're not sure exactly where it fits in this list of things, it may be a specialized conservation study that you need. Handicap accessibility studies are pretty popular with old buildings. We know that accessibility can be a bit of a challenge, and our handicap accessibility studies will help you determine how best to make your building accessible to everyone. And lastly, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing analyses. So if you need to upgrade your HVAC system or put in a fire suppression system, and you really want to preserve the historic fabric of your building and not go ripping into walls, then one of these studies will help you lay the groundwork for that project. So in 2020, 2020 was our largest TAG grant year ever. We awarded 26 grants across 18 counties in New York State, and just under $100,000 awarded. So this is thanks to our partnerships with the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation and the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area. They give us additional funds to make our grants go a little bit farther on Long Island and in the Hudson River Valley. We awarded project types that go across the spectrum, 7 building condition surveys and a couple of handicap accessibility studies, a ton of engineering and structural analyses this year. So we're going to move on and talk about Preserve New York grants. If you have any questions about TAG grants, feel free to type them into the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them. Preserve New York grants are our largest grant program. The maximum award is around $10,000. For Preserve New York grants, the grant awards are pretty flexible. Sometimes they're more than $10,000. Sometimes they're as little as $3,000. With TAG grants, our project types are flexible. With Preserve New York grants, our award amounts are flexible, but we only award for 4 specific project types for Preserve New York, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So these grants also require a 20% cash match, just like our TAG grants. So in 2020, we awarded 19 grants across 15 counties in New York State, just under $200,000 is all in grants. The project types you can see listed here: building condition reports, historic structure reports, cultural landscape reports, and cultural resource surveys. And the little colored circles show those. The yellow ones are the cultural resource surveys. We awarded a slew of those in 2020, and we'll talk about why that's important in just a moment. So, as I just mentioned, we award 4 eligible projects with Preserve New York grants: historic structure reports, building condition reports, cultural landscape reports, and cultural resource surveys. And we'll talk about what each one of those means. The building condition report is an overall look at the condition of your structure. It will give you a roof to basement assessment of the condition of your building. It'll help you prioritize the building's needs, help you come up with a maintenance plan, a capital project plan. This is usually completed by an architect or maybe an engineer. It depends on your building's needs. These are highly useful documents to have. All of these reports that we fund through our grant programs lay the groundwork for later work for your building. So no matter what you're thinking of doing as far as capital projects, it's always best to have a planning project done ahead of time. It shows potential funders that you've done your homework and that you know what the building needs, you know what it's going to cost, and you know what you're asking for. So that's what funders like to see. And yeah, our grants just will help you leverage the money you need for your project. So here's an example of a building condition report that we funded in 2020. In Delaware County, Franklin Stage Company does their productions in this gorgeous building. Chapel Hall is what it's called. It's a 3-story Greek Revival building built in 1855. And it was owned by the Masons from 1911 to 1996. They took good care of the building, as Masons tend to do. And on the 3rd floor, they had a really amazing Masonic temple. Chapel Hall is listed on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the Franklin Village Historic District. Your building does not have to be listed on the National Register to apply for our grants, but it's always a good idea to pursue that if you can. There's a lot of benefits to doing so, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So a $5,200 Preserve New York grant allowed the Franklin Stock Company to hire Crawford and Stearns, architects and preservation planners, to complete their building condition report. So they could plan for continued restoration of the building, rehabilitation, and upkeep. So even though this building is well cared for and doesn't look like it needs anything, you just never know with old buildings. And so it's best to be prepared. So they're thinking ahead and looking at to the future for the preservation of their building. So another example of a building condition report that we funded was in Sullivan County. The Land Bank Corporation got a $5,000 grant from us, no, $8,000 grant from us to do a building condition report. So a little bit of history on this massive structure. Benjamin Yeager purchased this property in 1931 and had a Spanish eclectic mansion built on it in 1936 for a mere $30,000. The result was an 18-room, 2-story, magnificent building with a full basement. And now, nearly 100 years later, it needs a little bit of help. So an $8,000 Preserve New York grant will enable the Sullivan County Land Bank to hire Chanis and Anderson to complete a building condition report. And this report will help the land bank understand the conditions facing that building and lay out a plan for a comprehensive rehabilitation. So unlike the Franklin Stage Company and their very well kept building, this building needs a lot of help. So, but a building condition report is going to set them on the right course. All right. Now let's talk about historic structure reports. This is a lot like a building condition report, but it's got some architectural history built into it. So this may be completed by an architect or maybe a historian or maybe both. And this is an overall look at your structure, but it includes not only the condition of the structure, but its historical uses. And this is useful for buildings that are interpreted to the public. So if you have a museum building or a library and you want the public to understand the history of that building, if that's important to your mission, then a historic structure report is the way to go, especially if you don't know much about the building. And even if you've done some research on your own, there may be more to learn. So one example of a historic structure report that we recently funded was in Rensselaer County, the Troy Public Library. This is housed in the Hart Memorial Building, completed in 1897 to serve as a library and art gallery. This was designed by the New York City firm of J. Stewart Barney and Henry Otis Chapman architects. The American Renaissance style building echoes an Italian palazzo and is renowned for its Tiffany windows and glass floor stacks. A $15,000 Preserve New York grant will allow the Troy Public Library to hire a preservation architect firm to complete this historic structure report, which will determine how best to preserve this historic building while adapting it to meet the current and future needs of an urban library. So a lot of times we need to adapt our buildings to meet modern needs, and a historic structure report can help you plan for that. Cultural landscape reports. Now, these are similar to a historic structure report, but they deal with the landscape. So whether it's a natural landscape or a man-made landscape, it helps you understand how that landscape was created and how maybe you can recreate it for historic interpretation purposes. This includes a condition analysis and a description of the historic significance of the landscape. And this is usually completed by a landscape architect. So I have an example of a cultural landscape report that we funded in 2020 in Cayuga County is the Howland Stone Store Museum. The original 1837 house was known as Open Door, was extensively remodeled in 1888 and 1910. So it underwent some changes over the years. The 1910 vernacular colonial revival renovation was the work of a noted Syracuse architect, Albert Brockway. So, they're seeking to understand the changes that this building underwent over the years and the significance of those changes. A little bit of history about this beautiful building. Open Door was the home of William and Hannah Howland and their daughter Isabel. They were all leaders in the fight for women's suffrage. Now, the historic landscape design surrounding the building may have been the work of a pioneering female landscape architect, such as Ellen Biddle Shipman or Beatrix Ferdinand, both of whom may have had connections with the Howland family, may have had. So we don't know for sure. And this historic landscape report is going to help figure it out. $10,000 Preserve New York grant will enable the Howland Stone Store Museum to hire Jean Gleisner to complete this historic landscape report. And this will document the historic landscape so that modern parking and drainage needs can be addressed. So again, we have to, consider what we're digging up when we build parking lots. It's good that they're being mindful about it, and a Preserve New York grant helps with that. Now, this is a project from 2019 that I'd like to mention because we get a lot of questions about whether or not our grants can help cemeteries. And it really depends on how the cemetery is managed because of eligibility requirements and things like that. But we do fund cemetery projects on a pretty regular basis. If you missed our presentation on our grants and cemeteries last week, you can check it out on our website. It'll be available soon for viewing. It was recorded, I believe. So, but here's a good example in Owego of a cultural landscape report of a cemetery. This cemetery is built on a hillside overlooking Owego. It was part of the rural movement, which was to get burial grounds out of the center of villages and out on the land, out in the outskirts of town. So this cemetery dates back to 1851. Because it's built on a hillside, it's had some drainage issues, some erosion and runoff and things like that. The monuments are crumbling a little bit, and it just needs a lot of help. And the Cemetery Association wasn't really sure where to begin or how to begin to address these issues. So an $8,000 Preserve New York grant enabled the Village of Owego to hire Martha Lyon, landscape architect. And she completed a cultural landscape report of this cemetery to help show the village the way forward in managing the issues that it faces. They're really trying to open up this cemetery to the public. A lot of people go up there to sightsee, to picnic, and they want to make sure that people can safely traverse the trails and roads up on that hillside. All right, so last but not least, our Preserve New York grants fund cultural resource surveys. A cultural resource survey is an inventory of historic resources in an area or municipality. It helps determine the historic significance of the buildings in an area, the architectural styles that are represented, patterns of development, and it lays the groundwork for the creation of a historic district at the local, state, or federal level. This is important for a number of reasons. Cultural resource surveys can lead to listing on the state and national register as a historic district. You can have buildings listed individually or as a district. But when you list a district, you include all the eligible buildings in that area, and it provides incentives to the property owners in caring for their buildings. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. There are 3 levels of cultural resource surveys. The reconnaissance level is sort of a look around an area to get a sense of what's there and where the boundaries might be. Intensive level survey does some background research on the buildings and the development patterns in that area. And then all this can lead to a National Register nomination. So an example of a cultural resource survey that we funded in 2020 was for the City of Binghamton, Department of Planning, Housing, and Community Development. We funded their survey to the tune of $8,000 for their Main Street and Front Street historic district. This is an area that had been determined eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, but they needed to get a little bit more research out of the way and get the paperwork filled out to apply. So this cultural resource survey includes the preparation of the National Register nomination form, for that eligible district. And that opens up the potential use of the New York State and federal historic tax credits to everyone living in that district. That's a big deal to property owners. These tax credits are available for private residences, for income producing properties. You can see both in this picture. So this really helps the community revitalize a bit. So why is this important? Well, let's talk a little bit about the National and State Registers of Historic Places. So this is a designation that signifies the historic significance of the buildings in an area. This is different than local landmarking. You might know of local historic districts, local landmarks, and you might immediately think about restrictions placed on what people can do to their properties to make them look a certain way. Local landmarking is not all bad by any means. It's meant to preserve the character of a community. It's meant to include the voices of all the people living in that area so that everybody has a deeper investment in where they live, both in money and in civic responsibility. Local landmarking is important. The listings on the state and national registers is completely different. It's purely honorific, and it does provide a level of protection for these properties if there's development coming through that uses state or federal funds. Otherwise, the owners of these properties are free to do whatever they like to them. So it does not come with those restrictions that people often think of when they hear about the State and National Register of Historic Places. So it's important to understand the difference between the two of them. With a state and national register listing, whether an individual property or a district, comes some incentives for historic preservation for property owners. So you can take advantage of the 20% federal rehabilitation tax credit for income producing properties. There's also a 20% state rehabilitation tax credit for income producing properties, giving you up to 40% off of the cost of rehabilitations for your property. So that's pretty significant savings. New York State historic homeowners are also eligible for a 20% owner-occupied residential property tax credit. So this helps everybody take care of their historic properties. Now, your property does need to be listed in a historic district or listed individually in order to be eligible. This can also open up grant opportunities for municipalities and nonprofits in that area. And there are a few grants, very few, available to individual property owners. And I can help you find those as well if you want. All right, so to learn more about historic tax credits, I'm not going to talk any more about it today because there's a lot to know. We are having two tax credit webinars coming up soon. February 10th is our income producing tax credit webinar. And on March 10th, I'll be talking about historic homeowner tax credits. So I'll be sure and tune in for that. You can also check out the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation website. They have comprehensive information about tax credit programs. All right, now I wanted to mention a different kind of cultural resource survey. Not all of them are intended to lead to a historic district designation. So in Monroe County, in the town of Greece, the Greece Historical Society was interested in documenting the work of Thomas W. Boyd, and he's one of Rochester's first and foremost African-American architects. He was a master of mid-century design, and he did significant work designing buildings for communities of color and low-income communities. So many of his projects have disappeared over the years or been severely altered. So the Greece Historical Society wanted to start documenting these buildings, this important work of this notable architect. So a $15,000 Preserve New York grant will enable the Greece Historical Society to hire Barrow architects and preservation consultant Gina DiBella to complete a cultural resource survey. And this will help identify Boyd's buildings, calling attention to them, and hopefully further preventing further demolition. So the more attention you call to these buildings and show the public why they're significant, why they're important, it can help protect those buildings. All right, so are you ready to apply for a Preservation League grant? Hopefully you are. They are among the easiest grants you will ever apply for. And we have a two-step application process. You can go to our website right away and fill out the pre-application. This helps determine your eligibility to apply and helps you determine what project you're applying for. We can help you through this process, but fill out your pre-application first, and then we'll get back to you with the full application to fill out if you are indeed eligible. You should plan to contact a consultant soon. The sooner the better. People tend to get busy, and you want to make sure to get on a consultant's radar screen right away. We do have a list of consultants who have worked on our projects before. You don't have to choose from that list, but the reason you might want to is because they're familiar with our guidelines, so they know what it's like to work within the guidelines of a Preservation League grant. It just helps make things go a little more smoothly. Then start taking pictures. Start taking pictures of your building. For a Preserve New York grant, we need 10 pictures. This says at least 5. Well, yeah, you know, at least, very least. So start big. Take an overall picture of your building. You want to take one big picture for context, and then start narrowing in on the issues that you see with your building. If you want to do a building condition report, then start showing us why. Are things falling apart? Do you have concerns about certain parts of your building? Make sure that we have a good view of what it is that you want to do for your building. Go over your application checklist very carefully. We provide this along with the full application and grant guidelines after you've filled out your pre-app. So go over your application checklist right away and start planning to pull together the documents that you're going to need for your application. Follow the instructions, fill it out, submit your application and supplemental materials on time. Get them in on time. We can't take them after the deadline. And you can ask us questions anytime along the process until you submit your grant. So you might be wondering how we evaluate these applications. We pull together an independent grant review panel. It's made up from preservationists from across the state. Sometimes they're museum people and architects and engineers and people who know what goes into good historic preservation. We use 3 evaluation criteria to evaluate your grant. The first is the historic preservation excellence and project quality. So we'll be looking at how appropriate the project is for your organization, how timely it is, if it seems to make sense within the scope of your organization and its plans for the future. We look at your fiscal and managerial competence. So how have you handled grants in the past? How do you plan to handle fundraising for your capital project? We'll look at your organizational budget and see how things check out. We want to know that you can handle not just the project you're applying for right now, but the construction to come afterwards. And finally, we want to see that your project has a strong service component to the public. We want to make sure that the public is going to benefit in some way from your preservation project. So the deadline for Preserve New York this year is April 12th, so it'll be here before you know it. You have plenty of help, though, between now and then for filling out your application. You can contact me, Jana Rudler, or Shelley or Aaron at the Preservation League by emailing grants@preservenys.org. One of the 3 of us will get back to you to answer your questions. That's also where you will be submitting your pre-application. We'll look it over, make sure everything checks out, and send you your application right away. The turnaround's really fast for that. If you're curious about other funding sources, they do exist, and I can help you find those. Here are a few of them. The National Trust, you need to be a member in order to apply for their grants, but it's not a big deal, just become a member. The Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization Grant Program is fairly new, and that is a re-grant program. If you want to know more about it, they're having an information session tomorrow. So go to their website at landmarksociety.org and sign up to learn more about their grants. You can do that at noon tomorrow. Save America's Treasures is another one administered by the National Park Service. A couple others on my list. State funding sources right now are a little bit up in the air thanks to COVID, but things should be smoothing out soon. So there are funding sources available to religious organizations as well. We can help point the way. Here are two of the most popular. And yeah, I highly recommend the New York Landmarks Conservancy for any congregations that are looking to preserve their churches. There are a number of ways to keep in contact with us. You can visit our website. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We are on YouTube. This webinar and a bunch of others are right there on our YouTube page, so you can go back and watch them and share them with your friends. You can email us at info@preservenys.org. You can email me directly at jrudler@preservenys.org. If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. We rely on your support in order to do the good work of preservation across New York State, so you can go to our website and do that if you wish. Be sure and tune in to our upcoming webinars coming up. There will be one more New York grant info session coming up on February 25th at 1 p.m. So if you missed this one, or you want to see what Erin Tobin has to say about Preserve New York grants, she'll be presenting the next one, and you can catch that on the 25th. We're also doing a series of application workshops, so you can drop in and get one-on-one help with your application during these workshops on Mondays and Thursdays in March and April. So check out our website for those dates, sign up, drop in, and get help with your application in real time. We also have a webinar series, Sparking Recovery, and you'll see those dates on your screen. February 10th, tax credits. We'll be talking about National Registered Districts, specifically on the 22nd, and historic windows on March 22nd. So if you want to know how to take care of your historic windows, then please tune in. Go to our website to sign up. These are eligible for continuing education credits for realtors, planners, and architects too. So I hope you can join us.